This is a wonderful Sunday. It's one of my favorite Sundays. World Communion Sunday, as you obviously have probably figured out, with the flags that are draped across our front porch and throughout our halls and here in the sanctuary. It is a time to remember the worldwide nature of God's love and God's community that spans cultures and languages, and we celebrate this sacrament, which is celebrated in all sorts of ways all over the world, in different cultures, around fires, around tables, outside, inside. And I thank everybody who brought something to our feast this morning. We are going to gather in a special way this morning as we come forward to receive the elements, but then we're going to invite you to stick around up here for a little while, talk to somebody you don't know, get something to eat. I'm looking at really good-looking figs down here and some apricots and some, I think those are like little Joey smoked sausages or something up here, and some fig Newtons. There's all sorts of wonderful stuff up here. The thing is that for the first few centuries of our church, this is what communion was. It was feasting together in each other's homes, washing each other's feet, loving each other. And so we're taking a little bit of a step back in time here to recognize our beginnings as a church, but then how do we pull those lessons? How do we pull that truth of loving each other, gathering with each other, sharing life with each other into today's world, today's context where we often find ourselves a bit overwhelmed, perhaps even feeling isolated and alone with our struggles in this big world of ours? We are stepping into a new series as we have moved out of, and thank you once again for all of you who shared your doubts and your skepticisms, your concerns about this Christian faith of ours, and it was a really powerful series. We are moving now into a series called Art and Faith, and it will culminate at the end of this month, the beginning of next month, with our Art on Oak, which is going to be fantastic. I literally run into two different artists at different things that were happening in different parts of the city, and I said to them, "Oh, I love your work. You should show at this thing we got going on at Second Presbyterian Church." And both people said, "Oh yeah, I'm coming. I already know about it. I'm going to be displaying my stuff there." We've got, how many do we have? Like about 30 different local artists who are going to be displaying their things here on the front porch, in our Westminster Hall, in our community room. And we don't see the display of art, the creation of art, whether it is song or it's dance or it's paint or it is the art of the culinary arts or the art of gathering together. We don't see that as something somehow separate from or tangential to our faith, our living faith in Jesus Christ. That is absolutely part and parcel fundamental to our relationship with each other, our relationship with God, because all of us know that there's plenty that goes on in our lives and plenty of truth and power that is communicated in and through us by things that cannot be contained by words or even books, right? And so the gift that God gave us in art and the ways to express and embody God's love in art and our love for each other and creativity and anger and frustration and joy and disruption, all of those things, we're going to be looking at that over the next month. And so if you are an artist and you've got ideas or thoughts, we would love to hear from you, and perhaps maybe even a way that you can share after service the way that you kind of depict art, your artistic gift. And for those of you who don't have much of an artistic gift in your bodies, you can just kind of celebrate and enjoy it with the rest of us. One book that I would recommend to you this year, probably one of my favorites that I've read, is called The Art of Gathering: How We Meet and Why It Matters. It's written by a woman named Priya Parker. She's a scholar, and she is the daughter of a conservative Baptist father and a Unitarian Hindu mother, and through her whole life and after their divorce, she had to navigate how it was that you came together and you shared different traditions and ways of doing things, and the ways that you needed to be very intentional about this art of gathering, whether it's in your home or it's for a committee or if it's in a space like this. How important it is for us to think about how we gather, why we gather, and what end do we have in mind when we gather. Because the fact of the matter is, as Parker points out in her book, one of the first things, she says, if you would note, one of the first things that an authoritarian or a totalitarian state government leader will do when they get into power, one of the first things they do is they limit the ability of people to gather. The right of assembly is quickly put on the back burner, right? Does this make sense? Have you heard this before? Do you know why that is? It's because the most powerful, disruptive thing that we can do together as humans is to get together in a room with somebody else, look each other in the eye, and share our common needs and struggles, and care for each other, and recognize that together we are far more powerful and beautiful and effective than we are alone. Literally, the world is changed when people like you and me get together in rooms like this, and we look at each other, and we share our lives. We risk enough to be vulnerable enough to share our lives, our hopes, our dreams, our concerns, our fears, and we listen to each other, we care for each other, we recognize, as our call to worship said, that we belong to each other. We aren't strangers, we actually belong to each other. And when we can engage with each other and share in that way, we literally can change the world. That is how the world has been changed. Think back to all the different revolutions and transformations that took place. It typically started in someone's kitchen or at a pub or at a cafe when people got together and began to share life and concerns, and then they begin to scribble on the backs of napkins plans and ways that maybe we can move forward together. And because that is the most powerful thing we can do together as humans, is to actually connect with each other, listen to each other, care for each other, and work together, there will always be forces that try to keep us from doing so. Whether it is an external force that doesn't want people to assemble together and stay in your own lanes, right? Only listen to one national story or narrative. Don't listen to your own. Don't get together, right? It's a controlling thing. And then, of course, if we take it to a personal level, within each one of us, there are forces at work interpersonally or within our own lives that keep us separated from others, right? Narratives or fears that run in our minds. It's interesting that when we go through difficult phases in our life, we go through something that breaks us and hurts us, something that scares us, typically the first reaction we have is to pull back, to isolate ourselves. And there's something to that, to lick your wounds. But to stay there and to remain there becomes detrimental, because either we heal by growing a thicker crust around our hearts that keeps us from hurting in that way, or we remain there and we continue to build up the anxieties and the fears and the stereotypical things that we think about other people. We fill in the gaps with our own understandings of things, which oftentimes is not that accurate. And so Jesus says to us, come together, get together, don't stop doing this thing. Look at each other, wash each other's feet, feed each other, eat together, share life together, love each other. It is the most powerful thing that you can do. If we can get out of our living rooms, if we can pull ourselves out of our caves, our kitchens, if we can get out from behind our screens, out of our heads, out of our worries, and actually come together like this, we can change the world. If you don't believe me, this is actually the reason we're here today, is because a handful of women did something just like that. It was about 150 years ago. 7 women. This isn't actually the 7. I Googled 7 women in 1860. 7 women. 7 women in Kansas City who were scared, angry, frustrated, had a common concern for this thing called slavery, which was legal in our country at that time, and that they lived in a border state where a lot of horrible things were happening, and they wanted to take a stance on the issue of slavery and people owning other people. And these 7 women and they brought 3 men along. They started to gather in kitchens and over coffee and tea. And they realized that the church that they were a part of was not going to address this issue, this fear they had, this anger that they had. And so they began to scratch on their napkins a plan to start a new church, and that became Second Presbyterian Church. That's how the world is changed, yeah. That's how the world changes, when we look at each other and we are risky enough, bold enough to share with each other our fears, our dreams, our hopes. We scratch ideas together, we start new movements. It's a powerful thing. And oftentimes these powerful movements begin around a table, a cup of coffee, taking care of, participating in the fulfillment of Maslow's lowest thing on the hierarchy, eating. sharing common humanity. There's something about that connects us. Powerful things happen when we gather together with others and truly participate and see them not as the other, but as one of us, in fact, as part of us. This is what we call Holy Communion. Holy Communion. The Holy Communion part is not what the church has kind of made it over the years, and I understand. I love pomp and circumstance and polish and all those things, but what we have made Holy Communion into is that there is some holy table that's got a holy, beautiful chalice on it filled with holy wine and holy bread, and a holy man like myself stands and says certain incantations over that, and then you can come forward and you can partake of this Holy Communion. I think that's actually not what Jesus had in mind when he instituted this thing. The Holy Communion part is the holiness we experience when we commune with each other, the body of Christ, when we wash each other's feet and we pour a glass of water for the other and we eat together off a common plate and we take care of each other's kids and we help each other up. That is the Holy Communion that the power of God works through to bring connection, to dispel isolation and anxiety, and to create new iterations of the kingdom of heaven. That's the Holy Communion. That's the feast that Christ told us to celebrate again and again. Jesus, as he was on the earth, had plenty of occasions to get together with people around the table. That seemed to be one of his favorite things to do, to gather in people's living rooms or under a tree or at the edge of a lake and break bread and talk, have difficult conversations together. And he gathered with his disciples, and he gathered with political and religious rivals, and he gathered with little kids and older people and women and men and prostitutes and priests. Jesus kind of got them all together on a regular basis, and they broke bread together, and they shared life. They talked about things, and truth was communicated, and lives were transformed. Holy Communion happened. And then as Jesus was gathering with his disciples for the final message, before I leave you, if you don't learn any other thing from me, if you don't remember one other thing, just remember, do this, he says. Do this. Gather together, wash each other's feet, eat food together, share together, cry together, care for each other, love one another in gatherings like this. This is what I want you to do. Have dinner together on a regular basis. It sounds interesting, and it looks beautiful up here when you've got a feast laid out, but really it also sounds quite mundane, right? Why would this be the thing that Jesus would make the paramount, preeminent commandment before he left the disciples? Have dinner together regularly. Come together. Get out of your houses. Don't just pass each other in the corner. Don't just nod or tip your hat or have a quick conversation. Don't just have a group chat or be on the same Facebook page. Get together on a regular basis. Wash each other's feet, eat food together, talk to each other. Why was that so important to Jesus? Well, I think it becomes more understandable to us if we think about the setting of that meal, right? When Jesus gathered together with his disciples in that upper room and they shared a meal together, do you remember what happened after they got done sharing that meal together? Where did they go? Do you remember? After they left that upper room, the story goes on in all the Gospels, they went to a garden. It was not that far away. They went out to a garden together. Remember this? And they gathered in this garden. It was late at night. And what did they do? They prayed. Jesus said, let's just pray. They got together and they prayed in this garden. These peaceful people, men and women, and when we talk about the disciples, sometimes you think of just the 12, but scholars really believe that there was a larger group of people that were kind of known as Jesus' disciples, that were women, wealthy women that supported his ministry, and probably some kids that came along and others. So there's probably about 30 or 40 of them gathered in this garden at night, and they're praying together. They've just had this sacred meal together. They're praying together, and then who shows up? Do you remember? Do you remember who shows up uninvited? A group, right? A group of people. There's countless pictures that you can find of this disruption that takes place. A peaceful gathering in a garden, people praying, and then depending on which gospel writer you read, it is either the temple police, kind of the police who would have, their clubs in their uniforms and would guard the temple. They were sent out. It was like kind of the police of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, their own personal bodyguards. They sent them up to the Garden of Gethsemane. One of the gospel accounts says that it was Roman guards were there as well. But anyways, these people show up to this peaceful prayer meeting with clubs and swords, and Judas kisses Jesus, and a fight breaks out. And it doesn't last very long because the disciples don't have much, and because the disciples are scared. Jesus is grabbed, and he is handcuffed or something similar to that, and he is led away. And you know what his disciples do? They run. Mark puts it this way. He says, all the disciples left him and ran away. Then the soldiers, it said, they grabbed one disciple wearing a linen cloth, but he left the linen cloth behind and ran away naked. You can see him there on the right. He's the naked guy running away. Why did Jesus say it was so important to gather together? Because he knew, literally in this evening, within hours, but in each one of our lives, there will always be forces that will come that will scare you. And when we get scared, we disperse and we run into our own corners. We take off and we go back to someplace quickly that'll help us to feel safe and secure, right? And sometimes when we leave, we feel totally naked and we're embarrassed. We don't want people to see us. We want to be isolated, right? That's what we do as humans. When things get difficult, when things get scary, and they always do, whether it's in your own personal life or if you happen to be in Caracas or Hong Kong, peaceful protesters come together, and oftentimes scary stuff happens. And rather than dialogue and staying together, often we run to our corners. We take off because that's what you do, right? You want to take care of yourself. And oftentimes the force that pushes us or pulls us away into our corners is a fear or an anxiety or an insecurity in our own mind. Somebody says something and we interpret it in one way and it hurts our feelings, and we take off and we don't talk to that person for the next 2 or 3 months, right? Jesus said, keep coming together, keep coming together. In fact, let's make it a sacrament. Get together on a regular basis. And in fact, the early church, they got together, it says, if you read through Acts and some of the epistles, they got together every day in each other's homes, or at least once a week. They got together in each other's homes, and this would have been, remember, I don't know if you, but Paul had to write a bunch of letters, said, listen, you know, there's Romans and there's Greeks, there's Jews and there's Gentiles, there's men and there's women, there's slave owners and there's slaves. All these folks are coming together on a daily basis or a weekly basis, and they're eating food together, washing each other's feet, sharing life together. And then after that, we understand that the first century church, then they would go and they would feed the orphans and the widows. That was basically what church was 2,000 years ago. Taking turns, going to each other's homes with people that were different than you, sharing food together, washing each other's feet, learning lessons together, and then going and serving the orphans and the widows. Isn't that interesting? Jesus said, keep doing this because I know you will get scared, you will get anxious, you will get fearful, and you will take off back to your corners. Where do you go? Where do you retreat? Is there a corner of your mind that you go to and thoughts that you start to kind of rehash or celebrate? Is there a routine? Is there an activity that you go to that somehow is self-soothing, but you find after a while that once you've gone back to that place mentally or physically or whatever it is, that it might feel good for a moment, but if you stay there too long, it actually just adds to your anxiety and whatever feeling of loneliness and isolation you have? We all do this. So Jesus says, come together. In fact, when Jesus, after he died, he came back to his disciples, and about 3 or 4 different times in that small period of time when he came back to earth before he was resurrected, he continued to get people back together, have meals together. He went and he found Peter and James and John, who had gone back to their corner, which was fishing in the middle of the lake where, you know, they were probably safe and doing what they'd always done. And Jesus calls them to the shore, and what does he do? Do you remember what he does? He cooks them a meal. Come here, you guys. And they have a conversation. And he says, don't forget, love each other. Don't forget, love each other. Go find the other disciples. Keep getting together. Because your fear is going to drive you apart. Your anxiety is going to isolate you. There's always going to be forces that don't want you to gather. You need to push against those forces. You need to take risks. You need to be willing to share your life, open your life, look each other in the eyes, and experience Holy Communion, because that's how people will know you're my disciples. That's how we're going to continue to change the world. That's how the kingdom of heaven comes. You are the change makers. You are the powerful expression of the body of Christ when you come together and you experience Holy Communion, which can't happen when we're alone. And we feel alone a lot, right? I don't know about you, but if I spend too much time just thinking and wondering, I tend to worry. Whether it's things that are going on in my life or in my family's life, health struggles or tragedies, financial stress, relationships that feel broken, all of those things. And then you add on top of that all of the macro stuff that comes at us day in and day out. We are blessed these days to have these fire hoses of information that just hit us over the head again and again with every wrong thing that's happening in the world, with bold headlines. The Amazon is on fire. The Amazon is on fire. And we've just had another hottest year in recorded record. And the president of Brazil, like it seems many other world leaders, seem more concerned about their power and their interests and less concerned for some reason with international goodwill and the sisterhood and the brotherhood of all of us. And because of rising temperatures and decreasing coastlines and war and poverty, immigration continues to be an amazing force, massive scale. People fleeing and walking on foot and struggling to find asylum and help. Middle-class jobs here in our country that used to be the bread and butter of our identity continue to be outsourced or eliminated or replaced with technology. I just read this the other day. It's startling. 45% of non-elderly Americans do not have health insurance. 45% of non-elderly Americans do not have health insurance. And so when you get sick, you get scared. The gap between the poor and rich in our country continues to widen, larger than it's been for over 100 years. People continue to deal with staggering amounts of debt. People of color in our country continue to be paid less than white people and incarcerated and shot at rates far higher than white people. And then, of course, you've got a lot of white people who feel that they're being discriminated against and now pushing back. The abortion rights battle continues to escalate, and now our Congress is officially investigating articles of impeachment of our president. There's plenty of stuff, friends, to keep us feeling overwhelmed, angry, skeptical, divided, defensive. And Jesus says, fear not, and get together, come together. Old and young, Jews and Gentiles, friends and rivals, come together. The other thing that is interesting about this time in our nation's history and in the world is that along with all of these pressures and challenges that can be isolating and scary, is that we continue to grow more and more individualized and isolated in how it is that we interact with the world or don't interact with each other, or at least virtually we think we do. Right? There used to be literally 3 channels that everybody stared at to get the news for the day. Remember those old days? And it really wasn't that long ago, when I was still a little guy, that not many households had televisions. And so people would literally gather in public places to watch TV together. When you go home, Google people watching the moon landing, and you will see people standing outside of department stores, crowded in someone's house who has a television. We literally, not only do we have 3 places to get news from, we sat there and listened to it together. So when you got the bad news or the good news, you were sitting around other people. Now, friends, we sit in our cubicles, in our homes, wherever we are, and we stare at this thing alone, and we drink in the misery and the pain of the world by ourselves. We are more and more isolated, not just in how we get information, but how we entertain ourselves. Interesting statistics about how later and later and longer our youth go before they get their driver's license because they can just sit in their bedrooms and connect, right? And when you've got things to worry about and you've got these world pressures and you hear about it, I mean, literally 20 years ago, we wouldn't have even known that the Amazon was on fire. And you can't worry about things that you don't know about. Now we know everything. So not only do we have anxieties that we're dealing with in our own lives in the world, but we find ourselves in more kind of fractalized. We can choose from any one of 500 channels, plus our favorite YouTuber or our favorite Twitter feed, whatever it is. And so once the algorithm learns what it is we like, it just continues to feed us that information, right? So we get even further isolated. And when I am worried about whatever it is, white lives matter, or if I'm worried about the environment, I will just hear more and more stories about that continue to build on my fears and anxieties, right? We get pushed into our corners. And Jesus says, come together. Come out from your hiding places. Come out from your canoe. Come out from your kitchen. Come out from behind your screen. Come together, look each other in the eye, share life, experience Holy Communion. Be the powerful people that I've called you to be and change your life and each other's lives and change the world. Communion. I experienced this not long ago at a day-long retreat that I was invited to go to that I didn't want to, but I reluctantly went to. It was in St. Joe's, and it was about 100 or plus people from churches around the Kansas City area, about a 5-county area, and we were up in St. Joe's, sitting in this big room, and 2 leaders led us for the day. One was an African-American man. The woman, I think, grew up in the DRC or Central African Republic, but she had been in the United States for a while. Both of them are professors in the Atlanta area. And they travel around the country and they facilitate what they call fearless dialogues, where they bring people together who they know don't agree on certain things, and they challenge them, encourage them, force them to talk to each other, listen to each other, deal with issues that we're told in polite society we don't talk about in public. We talk about those things and figure out how we do that in ways that are helpful and don't push us further into our corners. And one of the things that they talked about, an idea that they expressed, was this idea that each one of us, especially as Christians, should be people who wield the power of interrupting hope on a regular basis. We have got to be the ones that interrupt the anxiety and the toxic anger with hope on a regular basis. And here's the definition of interrupting hope. I thought it was a good one. Interrupting hope is a disrupting desire for existential change that is generated and sustained in a community. It names difficulties, envisions possibilities, and inspires work towards transformation of self and other. Interrupting hope reroutes the toxic flow of rage and nihilism. It looks danger in the eye and believes that in tandem with a community of others, the pursuit of visibility, voice, and existential change outweighs the threat of psychic harm or physical death. And then they did this. They had the audacity to ask us, sitting in this room, people that we didn't know that very well, they said, we want you now to turn and find someone that you don't know and move your chairs so that you're actually sitting face to face and your knees are almost touching, which is awkward. It's uncomfortable, right? Especially for good Midwestern people who are trained to sit next to each other and not face each other, right? They said, we want you to find someone you don't know and sit with your knees almost touching. And then they explained to us what they're going to do. And it basically came down to this. You're going to take turns. You're going to look at each other, and you're going to take turns for 90 seconds. First one person, then the other. But what you're going to do is you're going to look at the stranger in the eyes. You're going to make eye contact with them for 90 seconds. No words. You don't need to do anything else. Just make eye contact. And you are going to communicate, first the first person, then the other. You're going to communicate compassion and abounding love and delight for that person just through your eyes. You're going to look at them. And after they got done explaining, you could feel the tension just rise in the room. Right? I'm going to do what? I haven't stared at my wife in the eyes for 90 seconds for probably 10 years, you know? And you want me to do what? I mean, if someone had told me that day going into this conference, you're going to do one of the most embarrassing, difficult, powerful things you've ever done, and it's going to last 90 seconds, I would have thought, I don't know, it's going to be a fist fight. Is it going to be like, what is this going to be? There was this gentleman sitting across from me, big bear of a guy from some rural town around Kansas City. Didn't know him at all. And we started, and he looked me in the eye. And it was interesting, around the room, as this practice began, you started to hear nervous giggles over here. And some people you could tell just couldn't do it. One person had to stand up over here. But what happened more often, what happened to me, is people just started to weep. Because for many of us, it wasn't since we were a child that somebody looked at us for 90 seconds and communicated unending, passionate love. It's a powerful thing. And I found myself crying after about 60 seconds. I was like, I don't know if I can handle this anymore. And then it was my turn, and I tried to do the same thing to him through my tear-stained eyes, right? And when we were done, the two of us stood up and hugged each other. I didn't know this guy. I will never forget his face for as long as I live. And the people that were running this said, we've done this in prisons, we've done this all over the world, literally. They said, you will never see this person again in your life in the same way. And there have been people who have said, and some people in the room that day said, when she passed the mic around, she said, what did you feel? And one person said, I don't know, this is kind of weird, but I felt like God was telling me how much God loved me. And she said, actually, that's not bad theology, isn't it? Because aren't each one of us repositories? Doesn't the Spirit of God live in each one of us? And the gift that we can give each other is to look each other in the eye and to communicate how beautiful and how loved you are. What a gift. It will change people's lives. 90 seconds. And so Jesus says, I know you're scared. I know you're alone. I know you're anxious. I know there's fears. I know there's worries. I know you will be driven to your corners. This is what I want you to do. Keep getting back together. Keep looking each other in the eye. Keep loving each other. Keep washing each other's feet. Gather with your enemies. Gather with Gentiles. Gather with slaves and free. Gather together and love each other, because that love will transform your life and will transform the world. And that's how this revolution will grow. People will be filled with awe. Just watch. Our scripture reading this morning comes from Acts chapter 2, and I want us to conclude by reading it together as the people of God. So let's stand together. We've actually got the slide up here. And let's read these words from Acts. Alex, can you do that for me? The believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching